welcome to the SketchUpiest podcast in the West, SketchUpTalk. I'm your host, Aaron, and with me today is my friend Mark Harrison. Say hi, Mark.
Hey, Aaron. How you doing?
Good. So Mark is a product manager here at SketchUp. Mark handles all of our SketchUp for web responsibilities, product managerially speaking.
That's about right. That's about right.
Okay, so we've had a couple guests this season who are product managers, and I always ask them the same thing because not everybody knows what that term means. So I would like to get your take on it. So what would your definition be for product manager?
Wow.
No pressure, but I did talk to your boss, and if you don't get this right, you have a 2-hour meeting right after this recording.
Well, I'm going to get into it, but I just want to say if my answer is not on point, it's because the chair that I'm sitting in is not very creative. I can already feel a creative block underneath me, so I'm going to do my best in this podcast. What does product management mean? Actually, would you believe I just wrote a job description about this, so I should be able to answer the question.
Good way to know what you're doing, I guess.
But basically, I kind of couch it in two ways. One is being a student of the people that use SketchUp and trying to improve SketchUp, for the ways in which people actually use it. And one of the biggest things there for me is, one of the biggest things people do with SketchUp is learn to do 3D modeling at all. So I try to be a student of how people learn SketchUp specifically. Hopefully get a chance to talk about that today.
Oh, sure.
And the other thing is our product managers are also sort of like hip attached to the product management team. So there's where the responsibilities part comes in. We spend a fair deal amount of time tracking the forum to see what's going on with SketchUp, making sure that a lot of our products, which are actually services, things that are happening all the time, are working smoothly and are operational. That's kind of the more boring part, but often when things break, we learn a lot about how SketchUp works.
Nothing teaches like a problem you have to fix.
Exactly.
So, and that is for the SketchUp for web product. So
yeah,
that's different from SketchUp Pro that people install on their computer.
That's right. Well, it's different and it's not, which is kind of the great part about SketchUp for web. So probably about 4 years ago, our team was investigating how to make a version of SketchUp that might be more accessible to more people and still free. And one of the things that really helps with SketchUp for web is that it's software that we're making and improving and also deploying all the time, as opposed to our desktop version, which essentially gets 3, maybe 4 releases a year. In SketchUp for web, you always essentially have the latest flavor of SketchUp. Another distinguishing thing is that SketchUp for web notably doesn't have things that don't really help people learn. So a good example of that would be match photo is a pretty powerful SketchUp technique and in itself a little bit difficult to learn.
Right.
So putting a feature like that in front of someone who's totally new to 3D modeling is a decision we decided to make when we made SketchUp for web.
So definitely a different, very specific, targeting a different group with the introductory features and not necessarily.
Sometimes it's a different set of people and sometimes it's different. So, SketchUp for web, and this is a great thing about SketchUp in general, is that it's so broadly useful to so many different kinds of people. A lot of those people, like architects, for instance, or landscape architects, probably had some sort of professional background or academic background in which they learned to use tools like SketchUp. Maybe not the same exact tool, but design tools, maybe even something as different as something like Photoshop, very common. And the other people that use SketchUp might be woodworkers or someone who is installing his own or her own built-in bookshelf. Those kind of people might have zero experience in any kind of 3D modeling environment. And so there's kind of a spectrum between. There's also older professionals who have been practicing architecture for a long time but never learned 3D modeling. How different are they really than the DIY woodworker? Well, maybe in some important ways they already know how to draw. But in terms of learning how to use SketchUp, kind of similar.
And it's great because then as a product manager, you're just responsible for understanding how all of them could potentially use
everyone
SketchUp.
Learns everything.
Yeah, that's all. Add that to your job description. Everything for everyone. So this is very different from. So when I met you, you had a very different position. You were actually in marketing.
Yeah.
When I first met you, when I was on the outside, we met. I don't know, at a meeting or trade show or something. We've met.
Sure.
And you've been around for a little while. You've had a couple hats in SketchUp. Can you tell us how or where you came into SketchUp, or even all the way back to when you were first born and knew you wanted to be here?
Talk about myself for a while,
if you can handle that.
Cool. Maybe just a safe word for you when I should stop talking about myself.
I'll just be out there. You just let me know.
Okay. Cool. Well, actually, I remember we met when you were a product manager, by the way.
That is right.
Product manager for a SketchUp extension called Build Edge.
That is correct, yes.
Which had a wall tool, as I recall.
Yep.
But
actually, this is kind of a funny tool, or a funny story, because this ties it together. One of my developers on that product was Burra Barron, who, when I first came in, my first day of work, I was coming around meeting everybody, and I came over and said hi to Burra because he worked with me on Build Edge. And the first thing he showed me was SketchUp running in a browser.
Oh, that is pretty cool. That is pretty cool.
It all ties together.
Yeah, it is a small SketchUp world in more ways than one.
So nice.
And maybe my story will be kind of similar. I was when I was younger. I think I'm a little bit young, but I'm not so young anymore. But when I was younger than I am today, a job my first draft career coming out of college was in journalism. This is in the early aughts, and so before too long, a lot of the consumer magazines that I used to work for figured out that they needed to make websites, basically.
I should probably call that out first. That is such a journalism term to refer to your first draft of your career.
First draft of my career. I'm ready for a grad school acceptance essay.
Time for the final draft, huh?
So in this sort of like proto era of my career, I was a journalist. And one of the more fun projects I got to work on, and actually became my full-time job for about 2 years, was I worked for a magazine called Backpacker Magazine. We would use GPS units to collect tracks, GPS tracks of hiking routes that people might do in Colorado, where we were based, but also everywhere. So we would send GPS units to people in Vermont and have them hike the long trail.
I didn't know that. I'm a subscriber to Backpacker.
So we would use those maps in both the website and then also in the magazine. If we were doing a special about Alaska, we'd have a bunch of hikes from people in Alaska. And some of the GPS units we sent out as a more affordable way to collect the tracks were actually late, model flip phones. And they had GPS capability, very similar, maybe a little bit less accurate than the ones you might have on your phone today. And people would go out and they would use the phone to record the track, and then they would upload the track from the phone. And the app that they used to capture and upload the track was an app called Trimble Outdoors. And it just so happened that years before I even heard of SketchUp, I was working on a partnership between Trimble and this company that owned Backpacker Magazine. So after a couple of years, I started to notice that magazines, generally, people weren't buying so much anymore. And it didn't really feel great to be working so hard to make something that people weren't interested in and didn't find useful.
It's true.
So I did go to grad school. I wrote that essay. And I got an MBA, a Master's in Business Administration. And my focus was in both marketing and actually finance, weirdly, mostly because I like to get math problems right. So it was very validating to see the spreadsheets balance.
Wow. I have no idea what it's like to want to be part of that stuff.
Actually, I think you do. We'll get to that later. Aaron. Fast forward, I did this MBA. I kind of knew that I wanted to work in the consumer internet space. Literally the week that I was, it was a few months before I graduated that I saw a job opening in Boulder, where I lived, for a role at SketchUp, the community manager. and I had already worked with all these, for lack of a better word, random people across the country, trying to help them sort out like the problems with the GPS phone and the app upload.
That's community.
And in a lot of respects, one of the purposes, the roles the community plays for a software like SketchUp is community-based support, right? And so a lot of what happens on the SketchUp forum is someone being like, "Hey, I tried to open SketchUp and I drew the line into infinity," and that's where some of the learning happens. I actually remember talking to a SketchUp Sage maybe like a few months after I started in that job at Google, and he had no background in architecture, design, or anything, but he was a SketchUp expert. I said, "How did you learn SketchUp?" And he goes, "Well, I was, teaching myself, and I came across the forum, and I saw a question that I thought I could answer. So I like tested it out in SketchUp a little bit, and then I wrote the response." And this fellow, August Moore, just got hooked on figuring out SketchUp by answering people's questions. And that's
cool.
kind of what happened to me over the first couple of years that I was working in SketchUp. I just sort of like geeked out on learning how some things worked. Then we, you haven't heard the safe word yet. I'm just going to fast forward a little bit.
Keep rolling. This is working.
Fast forward. Google acquires.
So that was Atlas. That company you interviewed with was Atlas.
No, it was actually Google. Pardon me.
Oh, it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I worked with the SketchUp team at Google for about 2 years. Then Google sold SketchUp, as you know, to Trimble. And when that happened, the person that was doing marketing is a good friend of mine, Gopal Shah, who is now the product manager of Google Earth. He was doing marketing for both Google Earth and for SketchUp. And so the Googlers, they held on to Gopal, and so they needed someone with a marketing background to do marketing, and hence Marketing Mark. I think that was...
What's in a name?
Yeah. Like I said, I did study marketing.
Well, so I do have a question there too. The stories that I've heard was the SketchUp team didn't grow much at Google. So are you one of few hires that actually happened during the Google era?
I'll probably get this wrong if I try to answer it directly, but I think at one point I was like the last hire, or like both the first and last hire. I think I might have been for SketchUp at Google.
The hire.
I can't remember who was hired after me onto the SketchUp team, and I don't exactly know who was hired before. So it's possible that was the one and only team addition.
You're right there on the cusp then, right when the Google took over?
Level of truthiness in that statement is at 50-50, by the way.
So maybe.
Maybe, yeah. But the team has grown a lot since we moved just down the street, and that started in 2014. So yeah, I think probably the most significant thing I got to do when I was working in marketing is get people to help, because I wasn't a great illustrator or graphic designer or website designer, so we needed to hire a designer. Obviously wasn't a webmaster, so one of the people I was doing sales support, became a webmaster, and then actually became an engineer on the SketchUp team, and we hired a new webmaster. So that was one of, I think, the more fun parts of leaving Google was SketchUp regaining a little bit of its startup mojo, and Trimble really investing in the team that makes SketchUp.
Yeah, that was a good thing. I was very glad. I was very glad it happened.
How we recruited a product manager from BuildEdge.
So, when you wake up in the morning and you come here and do this job, why do you do it? And the ground rule on this question is you can't just say a paycheck, because I know there's something deeper in it, because you did move from being the head of marketing into this product management position. So I mean, this was a conscious choice that you made, and why do you do what you do?
Well, I would definitely. I mean, anyone who wants career advice, I think I'm actually a good person to give it, maybe. But this I could be wrong. But I, in the years of doing SketchUp marketing, my favorite events were always working with people, going to trade shows, going to 3D Basecamp. Like the best part of working on SketchUp is talking to someone who's trying to use it and helping them be more successful. it's not, I mean, and marketing at SketchUp is a really fun job, partly for that reason. You get to meet a ton of people, see how they use the product, and then share that with other people, hopefully to inspire them, maybe even to teach them how to do that thing, which could be really useful. So those were the parts of marketing that I really liked. I didn't love database marketing or digital advertising or like how do we get all the stuff to the trade show, but I really liked helping people learn SketchUp more. I think you can probably relate to that.
Absolutely, it's a great thing.
I would say, got fortunate to have been at SketchUp long enough to have answered enough questions that over time I wouldn't call myself a SketchUp expert, but I became fluent in SketchUp. That's probably a good way to put it.
Yeah.
There's
more to SketchUp than the drawing tool. There's a big piece around it.
Exactly.
Is what we're learning.
Yeah. Well, there's SketchUp and layout and 3D warehouse. I became fluent in all the SketchUp things, which was a really helpful, background to have as a product manager. When you're hiring a product manager, you typically can't hire someone. Actually, maybe you can, obviously, frequently, that has years of product experience. You might get domain. I think, I'm just going to steal from my boss now. Good product managers come from marketing. They come from engineering. They come from the domain. But the places that you either learn how to make the product, learn how people use it, or learn what the product needs to do in the market to be successful. Hopefully multiple of those things.
Yeah, that's a good reason to do it. So one of the terms you've actually used it a couple times. I don't know if this is conscious or not, but you have used the term learnability. And I know that's a big driving factor in you and the work you're doing in SketchUp for Web.
Sure. Thank you for bringing up that topic. I've used it several times when talking to you about this podcast, but that's why you thought I said it during the podcast. But yeah, I want to talk a little bit with
you just market me on that
and everyone else about learnability. Which is one of the great things about SketchUp, which is how learnable it is for a 3D modeling app. And I remember the first website redesign that we worked on when I was in marketing. There was a tagline that says SketchUp, the easiest way to draw in 3D. We had that tagline for 2 or 3 years. And ultimately, the more time I spent with people, I felt like it was an accurate description of SketchUp. It might be the easiest way to draw in 3D. It's a little bit, if you have no experience drawing a sphere, then SketchUp is probably easier than teaching yourself to draw it physically by hand. But really, drawing isn't easy. Learning to draw isn't easy.
There's a caveat or two.
Yeah, there's a few caveats built into the statement. And when I started in this product management job, one of the things that really became fascinating to me immediately was how learnable SketchUp is, but also how learnable it isn't. So if you think about how good SketchUp is at this pretty hard thing already, you also get a very good look at how good it isn't, and also how in general maybe software makers don't always make their software to be learnable. And that's the fun part about SketchUp for Web. It's the learnable version, right? If you are a person who is relying on SketchUp for construction drawings, you should definitely use the more powerful version of SketchUp. But if you're just trying to figure out like how to do 3D modeling, SketchUp for Web is the right place to start. So let's talk about a few learnability things. Some things that maybe I've been thinking about these things recently. Partly because I'm helping to write a book about learning SketchUp.
I heard about that. You're soon or at some time in the future to be a published author.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about some of these things. At the beginning of a book about how to learn SketchUp, you might take people through like, here's where the line tool is, and here's this and this, here's that. But what we wanted to do in the book, I've got 2 co-authors, Josh Riley, who's a colleague, and a gentleman named Bill Fain, who actually wrote the book AutoCAD for Dummies.
Oh, wow.
So to be clear, we're actually talking about SketchUp for Dummies, which is a revise of the current SketchUp for Dummies.
Which is based on a book written by Aidan
Chopra.
What, 10 years ago, 12 years ago?
It's an old book and needs a refresh. Although we're actually keeping a lot of Aiden's manuscript because he's really good at describing how SketchUp works.
Yeah, he did a great job.
But at the beginning of the book, what we said we wanted to do was get people set up for success in SketchUp. So we figure that means training yourself on a few learnability things. So a really good example of that, and some of this stuff might seem obvious, but some of the stuff might, when you think about it for a sec, if you're just a casual SketchUp user listening to this, maybe that's not really what's happening here. You might not realize that you might be 3D modeling with one hand tied behind your back. So a really good example.
Let's drop some knowledge on our listeners.
So the most obvious one probably is using SketchUp with a 3-button mouse.
Yep.
So if you aren't using SketchUp with a 3-button mouse, what is the impact of that to you, right? Well, just with the scroll wheel being able to orbit, pan, and zoom in and out with the scroll wheel, that's essentially how you are seeing in SketchUp. And the way that you see and think are kind of like interwoven together. So if you're not using SketchUp with a 3-button mouse, and every time you want to see differently, you're sort of like context switching in your 3D modeling brain to the orbit tool. First you find the tool, or you use a shortcut. We'll talk about that in a second. And you orbit, then you go back to the tool you were using, and you've just increased the weight that your brain has to carry while using SketchUp by a significant amount. It's one of the reasons that if you do use a 3-button mouse and then it's not around for some reason and you start using a trackpad, it just feels hard, right?
Well, and there's a thing that product managers look at, and I don't know, maybe normal people do too, but the non-normal product manager types talk about click count and how many times do you have to depress a mouse button or a key in order to do something. And that's a big thing there, is having to switch over and change commands to go do something and then change back afterwards.
Yeah. And for something as essential as seeing, right? Like in SketchUp, you're both in some respects looking at a screen, but also inhabiting the 3D model. So like the way that you navigate and see in 3D is, I think, not extractable from how you draw in 3D. So, really emphasizing and giving people, I make the metaphor in the book that the first time you orbit with your mouse scroll wheel button, it's like you're turning on your lightsaber in SketchUp. Like that's when you really are getting into the game. But there's some other things too, I think that, so we already mentioned another aspect of learnability that I love, and this is not the sexiest edge of R&D when it comes to SketchUp, but I think it might be one of the more impactful things that we could work on. And that's keyboard shortcuts.
Absolutely.
So,
just as important as that scroll wheel, in my opinion.
So we could go through this list right now and have fun, but I think that there's only a baker's dozen of SketchUp shortcuts, 13 shortcuts that you need to know to use SketchUp. And 13 is it's not actually, most of the shortcuts we're talking about, like the tape measure tool, for instance, the shortcut is T. You just need to know that it's
What's
T.
the word?
Yeah. But here's why those 13 are really important. Whenever you need to change to the line tool or the select tool, one way to do that, obviously, is to know, okay, that select tool is in the upper left of the screen on a Mac, for instance,
right.
And a lot of, or to have the large tool set open and know where those tool icons are. Or you might actually remember, if you use a desktop version of SketchUp, that it's in the draw menu. It's the draw menu, I believe.
Yeah, we'd have to check on that, but
anyway,
sounds like it could be.
What I'm saying is, at some basic level, you need to remember something, right? You need to know that the tool icon or listing is in a place. So you need to remember something about that tool, period. So now on top of remembering that something, then you need to actually take the physical action to move your mouse cursor over to that thing. And if it's in a menu, like the edit menu, you're already a few steps behind where you'd be if it was a tool icon.
Right.
So it's both slower, and I think it actually takes more memory RAM. So remembering the tape measure is T, I think is easier on your brain than remembering where it is amongst a set of tool icons that look pretty cool, but also similar sometimes, or what menu it's in. So just remembering tape measure T, you have just decreased the level of difficulty, of using SketchUp by another, I would say 20 or 30%.
I think that is a great example of why shortcuts are cool. And one of the things I really like about SketchUp specifically is that the shortcuts are also customizable. So talking about learnability, that's when you first get in there, you have R is rectangle, E is eraser, L is line, T is tape measure, like you said. But as you move forward and you start finding these other tools that in your workflow go beyond the defaults, you can still assign them. And in fact, if you want to move those, I like E for eraser, but because where my hand is on the keyboard, I want it to be Q.
Yeah.
You can do that. And that is a cool thing about not just the learnability, but then eventually customizability as well.
Yeah.
The same functionality.
I think and so now we're talking about like how learnability applies, I think, to not just someone who's new to SketchUp, right? Because if you learn to do something in SketchUp that's sort of important to your workflow, how could you also learn to make it easier to do? And shortcuts are a great example of that.
Absolutely.
That's one of my favorite. I think shortcuts, they're so juicy. They're not even they're not sexy keyboard shortcuts, but if you were to take like a handful of people that come to 3D Basecamp, people that are going to take a week out of their life to learn SketchUp, which means it's important to them, I would say that 50% of them aren't using shortcuts.
I was just going to say, I think that is one of those growth points in a SketchUp user, because you were talking about, listeners and where they're at and stuff. There's that beginning fundamental part where, you have to learn to use the scroll wheel to zoom and you learn your basic shortcuts. And then people get to that and it's kind of like a balloon that's like all the way full. Everything's there. But how do you pop that balloon and go to the next layer? Maybe there's a balloon in a balloon. And I think shortcuts is a big part of that.
It's how you increase the capacity.
People don't realize that oh man, I could customize this, and then this whole new world opens up.
Yeah.
It's like mentioning extensions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's just like extensions in some respects, and there's, and obviously, in that it increases your SketchUp capacity.
Right.
Like
you get SketchUp-ier.
Yeah, what you think is possible. Another sort of, I'm going to break my awesome podcast narrative here, but I'll jump ahead. But if it's hard if you already know SketchUp to like back yourself out of this, but if you think with a pencil, like how would I draw a cube? Like you could probably essentially imagine with the pencil how you're going to make the shape that represents a cube. Now do the same thing with a sphere. If you think about how you're actually going to draw a sphere, it's actually harder in your imagination to make the sphere with a pencil, right? Like it takes more like of your energy to imagine doing it. You know that a circle is involved somehow. Now in SketchUp, it's going to be easier for you to draw the sphere and give it some sense of depth and proportion.
Right.
But the same thing is still true. You're still actually in 3D imagining how to make the sphere. So that, and there's 3 or 4 ways to do that. Obviously, the Follow Me tool might be one if you're familiar with SketchUp. But what I'm suggesting is that no matter which way you decide to do it, all the other things that are happening in the background, like where the tool is in the menu bar, what the shortcut key is, or do I even know what the tool? Do I even remember what the tool is called? Those things actually cost you like your mental energy. And so if you decreased your cost, like actually the best way to learn SketchUp is to think less about SketchUp.
That's again it's a brilliant picture, because I've actually seen this on the forum recently where people are arguing about SketchUp is the easiest to use software, and I do think I know it very well, so it's very easy for me. And I do think one of the things that SketchUp's got going for it is it's the quickest software to get out of your own way. Like I've used other 3D modeling softwares where after using it for maybe a year, or actually I'll say this about like Excel. I've been using Excel for probably 15 years now, and I still can't remember where stuff is because I don't use it enough, and that's not my thing. But I think one of the things that SketchUp really excels at is it is easy to pick up those shortcuts, and the line tool draws a line. The rectangle tool draws a rectangle. You don't have like a primitive tool set or something like that where you got to think multiple layers deep. Like you said, it gets out of your way and lets you just go create the thing you want.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think we're talking about something really fun here, which is that when you're learned in SketchUp, when you've figured out how to do the basic things, you're still learning. Every SketchUp project, if you think about the Mandalorian helmet that you just modeled, you had to figure out some SketchUp problems along the way.
Absolutely.
So another sort of learnability dimension or sort of area that we like to think about is sort of removing the cost of effing up. I'm just going to say that this is a PG podcast, but basically, like, there's a little bit of, like, when I watch people learning SketchUp, people who come to training events, tension builds up. Like, it's an emotional experience to learn something. And it might be that the context of being in a training room with other people is also like difficult and emotional, but between the people not learning how to click, release, and then click again, like holding down, clicking and dragging, holding that mouse, and between people trying to remember where toolbars are or remember what order of operations does Follow Me work with. These are all things that we can make better in SketchUp, by the way, but they're also things that are pretty stable in SketchUp, and people just need to learn them. Tension builds up, and so learning that, like, messing up in SketchUp is just like part of 3D modeling. That actually is a really another like capacity building moment. So things like undo, things like the escape key, things like zoom extents, things that just sort of like help you reorient yourself or try again very easily. It is a thing that people are really hard on themselves, and it's
true.
Once you learn that there's no reason to be, I think that the cost of learning SketchUp comes down another level.
That makes a lot of sense. People talk about their favorite tool being Follow Me or Push Pull, but I still think undo is the best one. So
I actually have a favorite tool. I have a new favorite tool. And it's related to what we're talking about. And you probably have only seen it if you've been using SketchUp for web, which is at app.sketchup.com. Remiss to mention earlier.
We will have a link in the show notes.
My new favorite tool is Search in SketchUp for web. So this is a new capability. It's kind of related to all the things we've been talking about. We released this in the web version of SketchUp last year. We're still learning a lot about how it works, but yeah, we do have the intention of trying to bring it to more places in SketchUp. But basically what Search lets you do is very simple. You just search for tools. So instead of activating the section plane tool by going to the tools menu, maybe it's not draw, it's called tools, I think
tools, yes.
And then looking down the list for section plane, or putting section plane in your toolbar. Who puts section plane in their toolbar though?
People do a lot of sections, I imagine.
But or like the dimensions tool in SketchUp, right? Tools you don't really need very often. It's easy. It's not worth remembering a shortcut for section plane. There is one. I think it's Command Y on a Mac.
Yikes.
But it's really not even worth remembering it. It's just worth remembering that there's a tool called the section plane tool, and then knowing how to find tools when you know what their names are, right? So Search, there's a keyboard shortcut for it, which is Shift plus / on North American keyboards. That's question mark. And there's another one if you're not in North America, Shift plus S. Both of those keyboard shortcuts work to open up a little search dialog. You start typing right away, and we start matching results right away. So if you know what you're looking for, like the tape measure tool, boom, it's right there. You can press enter if it's the first result in the list, and it activates the tool right away. So it's a very quick way to activate tools.
So I had a question that, do you still have to know exactly what the name is, or like, so if it's push pull, but I call it extrude or something like that? Great.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. Maybe you're setting me up to have a great answer. But another sort of theory, and this is one we're actually still testing, to be honest with you and listeners, is that people don't remember what their SketchUp tools are called, right? You know that you need to measure something. but you don't know what the dimensions tool is or what the tape measure tool is just by looking at the icons. So if you just search for measure, we're going to show you both search results as well as a description for each tool. So you can tell which one is most relevant to what you actually are trying to do. But that, that still is more of like a match on the tool name. If you are trying to figure out how to copy something in SketchUp and you search for copy, we'll show you both the copy command, which is a command in SketchUp, but also above it, the move tool. So we try to help people learn. We're trying to help people learn SketchUp by meeting them where they might be thinking about 3D modeling.
Right.
So alongside matching the names of things, we actually match search results or SketchUp commands to modeling concepts or what we think, based on our experience teaching people SketchUp, people might be thinking about. Like, I need to grab this thing. That's the select tool. I need to erase this thing. That's the move tool. I have experience in Photoshop, so where's the transform command?
I was going to say, that's got to be a big piece of transitioning from any one software to another, is that terminology thing.
Yeah. So it's, we're learning. We measure how often people search. We measure how often people activate the results of the searches they make to see how to best tune our search algorithm to be a combination of matching the name of the tool, which is probably the fastest thing to do if you know what the tool's name is, versus also surfacing concepts. So if you search for box, you're going to get rectangle and push-pull.
Right.
But that also might intersect with the search command for Boolean. If you start typing Boolean, if you just type BO, you're going to get box because it's a better result. But if you continue typing Boolean, then we start showing you solid tools.
That's cool.
We also show you the shortcut. So if you don't know what the shortcut is, it's right there in search.
That's awesome. Well, that is an amazing overview of how your relationship with the SketchUp users as a whole is coming along. But I want to dive in for this last section on your personal relationship with SketchUp.
Oh, cool. Sure.
So this is a little section called How Do You SU? So a couple of questions here about you and SketchUp, your personal relationship. The first one is, do you remember the first thing you modeled in SketchUp?
Yeah, I do, actually.
All right.
So it was during grad school, actually probably about 2 or 3 months before I even saw the job posting. And I was in a product development class. So it actually, in fact, I did study product management in grad school too. It was a class called product development. And generally the class went through all phases of product research, prototype, rapid prototyping, market research, testing, validation, stuff like that. And so in the prototyping phase of the class, we had an assignment to do a prototype. And I'm just not a handy person. I don't have the woodworking tools, or glue, or I'm not craftsy. I just don't do like physical making of things. But I'm like, well, a prototype. My idea was a pizza slicer. So I kind of looked at the pizza slicer, and I feel like this thing is not very ergonomic. Like, as you drive through the pizza, you need to change your grip. Like, you want to really be able to crunch the pizza as well and slice. I'm a New York person, so
Crunchy pizza is a regional thing.
Crunchy pizza is, the crunchy crust is a part of a good slice of pizza. Otherwise, you just have a sloppy piece of wet bread.
Can't argue with that.
Anyway, so that's my product idea. And my first time I used SketchUp was essentially prototyping that in SketchUp as a 3D model.
So Pizza Cruncher was your first
Pizza Cruncher.
model.
Pizza Crunch. Yeah, Crunch Slicer. There's a good name for it, but I haven't thought of it yet.
No, the important takeaway is I want pizza now.
Yeah. And then shortly thereafter that is when I started answering SketchUp questions. So a lot of my relationship to SketchUp is definitely informed by what are people trying to do or figure out when they're first learning SketchUp, and I like to kind of figure it out along with them to best answer their questions. I'm a homeowner, so anytime I have a project, I use SketchUp. Actually, here's the interesting story.
This may actually transition, because one of the other questions next question I have is, what is your most recent SketchUp model?
Oh, okay. Well, I can answer that in two different ways. But the first, probably the biggest project that most people who use SketchUp have is their house, and so that is my biggest project, and one of the biggest SketchUp tasks in order to use SketchUp in order to do projects around your house is probably to create a model of your house, which involves modeling from a floor plan. So a couple of years ago, I was shopping for homes and I found a house that I was pretty excited about, and I made an offer. And it just so happened that it's in the same neighborhood as my product manager colleague, Sandra Winstead, who's the manager for our desktop applications, as well as her husband, Aiden Chopra, who wrote the original book, SketchUp for Dummies, both of whom are former colleagues and colleagues and friends of mine. So I ran into Aiden around town in Boulder. I said, "Hey, great news. It looks like we're going to be neighbors." And he said, "Oh, yeah, where are you living?" And I told him about the neighborhood I was living in, and it's an HOA and everything. And he said, "Oh, well, did you know that that's where Sandra and I used to live before we got married and when I was writing the SketchUp for Dummies book?" And I go, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah, it's in chapter 4. And if you just Google it, you'll probably be able to find the house." So I went back home, opened up 3D Warehouse. I searched SketchUp for Dummies, and there is the house that I just put an offer in 3D Warehouse, ready for me to adapt.
I want to say that's cool, but it's also borderline creepy.
It's meant to be. Meant to be is how I think about it.
That's a more positive way to look at it.
So once I had a model of my house, it just became really obvious to use it for things like space planning, for instance, or simple projects. Recently, we replaced the HVAC system, and so I basically modeled all the different system options to see what the trade-offs would be like in terms of space utilization. But the most recent SketchUp model that I'm most excited about, and I hope to either talk, explore, do more of with you, is from the Instagram No Plugin Challenge, which is a hashtag series of posts and community challenge on Instagram hosted by an architect in Iran. So we've been following these challenges. Actually, there was a new one posted a couple of days ago that I'm excited to get into.
Is it the folded paper?
The folded paper.
Yep.
So you can find this on Instagram. If you just search for No Plugin Challenge, you'll be able to see a whole bunch of SketchUp images and you can drill into them. But the notion is this architect, I only know his first name, Milan. I'm pretty sure. I have to apologize for forgetting the name. Aaron's going to look it up. It's my favorite thing on Instagram. Also, maybe my favorite SketchUp thing. And the reason is that these SketchUp forms that he shares and challenges people to post, you're supposed to model them without any plugins. Malad, thank you. And in doing that, and he's posted about this, I think, at the beginning of the challenge, his supposition was that using plugins actually decreases your creativity, which I don't know if I agree with, but I do agree with the notion that understanding how SketchUp creates geometry expands your capacity for learning SketchUp a little bit more. So if you understand the basic ways to create SketchUp forms and how it's a combination of the move and scale tool and select tool to create organic shapes, for instance, I think you become a little bit more aware of what you might do with plugins if you have them, or what extensions you might want to find even in the first place. So it's been really interesting to do these challenges, which are advanced, but they really help you relearn SketchUp in some ways too.
It is a great way to get back in touch with basic functionality.
Yeah,
for sure. And see that there's not, just because it's a native tool doesn't mean it's limited.
Exactly. Yeah, I would say advanced basic functionality. Yeah. Because if you think, a lot of his challenges, for instance, require like really good use of the select tool and really good use of X-ray or hidden geometry displays, basically, and select, and transformation tools, and keyboard modifiers.
Just everything.
Just basically everything. And it's sort of stoked. I'm already excited about learning, obviously, but here comes something where it's very tactile and proof that actually learning in SketchUp can be really fun. You kind of lose that after your first, few SketchUp experiences, because the push-pull tool is kind of normal after a while. But I think it's almost, I'm going to call it first-person evidence that learning SketchUp is fun, because I'm having fun learning SketchUp.
All right. I got 4 questions left, and we only got 5 more minutes till the next person comes in.
Let's do it.
So we're going to change this to a rapid answer. What is the most impactful SketchUp model you've created? I know I asked for the one that could have the biggest answer.
It's got to be the WikiHouse. We teamed up with the WikiHouse organization, a nonprofit that produces essentially flat packable CNC fabricated houses. And we, as a proof of concept, we teamed up with them to make a model and then also build it. It was amazing.
That's very cool. I do remember that. I was on the outside, but that was cool to watch. All right. Of everything you've built, what is the best SketchUp model you've ever won? What's the one that makes you beam with pride?
I think it's got to be the Batarang that I designed during Maker Faire in 2012. We were doing 3D printing, and I was pretty new to SketchUp, and we had brought some trinkets, for 3D printing, and people were kind of getting bored of them, like after a few hours of the show. So I just went onto 3D Warehouse. I searched for Batman logo, found a 2D Batman logo, brought it into SketchUp, made sure it was a face, extruded it, and then scaled down the top to give it a little bit of a bevel. And then they became like the hottest giveaway.
Nice.
For Maker Faire 2012.
So you're printing them on site and handing them out.
Yeah, exactly. They were kind of sharp and weapon-like, so in retrospect,
legal-ish,
a little risky, but definitely that became like the Maker Faire hot stuff of 2012.
That's awesome. And all right, flip side of the coin, what is the worst model you remember modeling?
A pizza cruncher was pretty bad.
The first one and the worst.
The pizza cruncher was pretty bad, but I will say that I was for my fiance's house where she used to live in Portland, we were building a fence last year, and I modeled the fence in SketchUp. And in order to try to do like some comparisons of different scenarios of like, it was a good neighbor fence. So we're like, how far apart do the fence boards need to be in order, for it to feel private in the yard still, but for it to be a little bit open to the people in the alley walking by. So we're looking at different options. In order to do that, I messed with layers and different layer assignments for different things within nested groups and components. And before long, it was the biggest SketchUp disaster I had ever made.
You broke rules.
Yeah.
You paid.
Yeah.
All right, last one, and you've actually kind of touched on this or before, but I'm going to ask you to commit to one thing. What is the one thing you see new users do wrong that you want to help them with? I know it's hard to pick out one, especially when we're just talking about learnability, but
man, it's tough.
What's the king? What is the?
Well, I just got to say that at a recent SketchUp training, I went into someone's preferences and turned off like their auto detect for click drag so that they could not click drag. So I do think it's actually click drag. For a new person, it's totally understandable. It makes total sense that the way you would think that drawing a line happens in most other software programs, going back to Microsoft Paint, is that you click and drag and click and hold that mouse button and drag it along. If you could just force someone to not be able to do that, which is what you can do through the preferences menu settings in SketchUp for desktop, to not be able to do that, I think would make a big difference on people's learning.
So you heard it here. If you are a click and dragger, Mark Harrison will come to your computer and disable that if need be.
It's for your own good. It's for your own good.
Well, on that note, I think this is where we will wrap. Thank you very much, Mark, for hanging out with us.
It's been a lot of fun.
And listeners, thank you for listening, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.